Joining us to reflect on all of this and more is our chief political correspondent, John Craig. Sky's Laura Bundock, once again at the other end of the house that we're both in. I think she's in the bedroom in the attic at the moment. And Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens. Great to have you all on board. Thank you very much indeed. Laura, perhaps we can start with you then. It was a positive message coming from the news conference. A lot of talk about these green shoots, and yet we're also being told that we can't be complacent.
Yeah, I think that stuck out for me. This green shoots comment is perhaps the comment that we all wanted to hear, isn't it? That what we're doing, the massive changes to all of our lives, the way we're working, the way we're living, the way we're interacting, getting our food, is starting to perhaps make a difference. So the whole idea is that by reducing the amount of social contact, you can therefore reduce the rate of infection, the transmission rate, which will in time reduce the number of people who end up in hospital, which should eventually reduce the number of deaths. But we're right at the very start of this battle, as it was made clear today. But I just think hearing those words, green shoots, will at least be a crumb of comfort, I think, to everyone who is stuck, wherever they may be stuck, working from home, homeschooling children at the moment, in whatever situation, on the front line of the NHS, that if we carry on doing what we're doing, it will eventually feed through. So what we're seeing in terms of the figures and the charts that were showed today is that there's been a bit of a plateau when it comes to that transmission rate. So the number of infections seems to be levelling off slightly. They're very keen to point out that you shouldn't take it day by day, that you need to look across this as a whole. But at the moment, what we're seeing is a slight levelling off. And that is good news, because, as I say, that should cut the number of people who end up in hospital and therefore cut the number of deaths. But there is a big, big but. We've got to carry on doing what we're doing. And that's why the message again was there is absolutely no room for complacency. There could be a winter ahead still if we don't carry on following the measures.
There's been a lot of criticism, Laura, about testing and how not enough testing is being done. Criticism, too, that we don't have enough ventilators. What was said there?
Yeah, I thought that was the other interesting point. There was a bit more detail about that for the first time, because we know that Boris Johnson says he wants to accelerate the number of tests up to 25,000, and we're not there yet. We're not there at all. But interestingly, we heard the detail as to why we're not there. And this is all about the availability of chemicals, the agents that these tests need in order for them to work properly. We just simply can't get our hands on those agents, can't get our hands on those chemicals, which is why we're not carrying out as many tests. Michael Gove said there, we must go further, we must go faster. But I think we're being held up now. We get a sense of why we're being held up because of some of the bits you need for the test. We just can't get our hands on these bits. Also, looking at the ventilators, the detail I heard there was that the first of those quickly built ventilators are kind of going to be leaving the factory this weekend and will be ready for operation on Monday. So a sense of the timescale there. It's not going to take days, it will take another week, but they will eventually be starting to be made and put to use very soon.
Well, before we get Peter's thoughts, let's turn to you, John. Something that struck me was Jenny Harries admitting that they got their personal protection equipment strategy wrong. Now, it's not very often, is it, in a government news conference that you hear somebody put their hands up and say, yeah, we got it wrong.
Yes, but Jenny Harries has already shown over the past week or so, she's very candid. It's often interesting for those of us who are used to listening to politicians at news conferences. These civil servants, medical chiefs and so on, scientists, are much more candid in some of their answers. You wouldn't get a politician admitting they made a mistake, whereas Jenny Harries been pretty straight with people. It was Jenny Harries a couple of days ago who, of course, said that the whole lockdowns could last 6 months. Now, whenever politicians, including the Prime Minister, until he's self-isolated, other senior ministers when they've been asked, they've refused to put a date on it. And so I think some of us have found it quite refreshing to listen to Professor Chris Whitty until he took to his bed or to his self-isolation. We've seen Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Advisor, and we've got used to Stephen Powers and Jenny Harries now. And you could argue that we're learning more from them than we're learning from the politicians who are just obviously trying to spin a line, if you like, pump out government propaganda to be crude about it, but we are learning a lot from these experts who are side by side with the politicians at these news conferences.
Did I hear you laughing there, Peter Hitchens? Do join us. What did you make of today's news conference?
Well, as ever with these things, I'm astonished by what's supposed to be an independent media's complete failure to question the whole basic premise of this thing. Here we are, a country which was previously free, confined to our homes by, I have to say, rather dubious legal procedures in an absolutely unprecedented fashion, and told we may have to stay there, being harassed by the police if we go out, for another 6 months. And rather than saying, well, hang on a minute, could this conceivably be a mistake? Everybody says, oh, well, can you give us some more details? How long will we have to stay under house arrest? How many ventilators have you got? How many this, that, and the others? And again, it just seems to me somebody should say, especially after the extraordinary intervention of Lord Sumption, perhaps the most distinguished jurist of our time, and certainly an extremely intelligent and acute person, saying that this whole thing is questionable, that ought to be, among at least political journalists, some attempt to say to the government, have you got this right? Is what you're doing in fact justified by the circumstances? Sumption's fundamental question was that, is this serious enough to justify these extraordinary measures? And I think his answer, along with mine, is I don't think it is. It's disproportionate. There should be much more questioning along those lines. There is no mathematical or scientific connection between the shutdown of the country, the crashing of the economy, the strangling of civil liberties that's going on. There's no connection between this and the level of deaths from coronavirus. None has been established. In no country in the world is there any suggestion, if you look at what's actually happened, of any link between any measures taken and a decline in coronavirus deaths. It's pure speculation, and it's being done...
Well, how about China? Sorry, Peter, to interrupt.
At a time when the economy already is in serious danger, it's shutting down the economy of this country in a most extraordinarily damaging way.
Sorry to interrupt, Peter, but one month ago there were thousands of new cases every day, weren't there, in China, and now there are just a handful, and that's simply because of the aggressive measures that were taken.
Well, is it because that's the most classic error of the post-hoc ergo propter hockey with what happened in South Korea? They didn't do this, and yet the infections fell there. You look at what happened in Hong Kong and Singapore. They didn't do this. They did other things. In fact, they did different things. Though, interestingly enough, although Hong Kong and Singapore did different things, the decline in the death rate was similar. Japan hasn't done it. They're not suffering particularly badly. Sweden hasn't done it. Their results are, as far as I know, not considerably or significantly worse than those of Denmark and Norway next door in proportion to the population. Every serious examination of this says we haven't got a formula. But the British government has chosen the formula which actually involves the most outrageous interference with our liberties and the most ludicrous attack on our ability to survive as an economy. I've never seen anything like it in my life.
Does this mean you don't trust...
Jonathan?
Go on, John. Jump in.
Jump in, John.
Peter and I worked together at the Daily Express for many happy years ago, but I'm going to now defend, as you might expect, the political correspondents who are attending these news conferences. I haven't been to one of the virtual ones, but I went to one in Downing Street a few days before they changed the way they were doing them. I think, to be fair to political journalists, the questions are okay. It's the answers that are rather lacking. You don't get a follow-up at these news conferences. It's harder also when you're on a remote video link. And as I come back to what I was saying a moment ago, you get more candour from the scientists, the civil servants, than you do from politicians who've obviously got a political agenda. As for the lockdown and so on, well, we all know that the government did rush through emergency legislation. Now, it didn't include police stopping people from buying Easter eggs and so on. And I think some of the sillier application of the rules has been by police forces and some local councils. And I think, to be fair to the government, they probably did need these powers. You can question whether some of the economic measures were necessary, but at the same time, I do think some firms are trying to exploit them for their own gains. The most recent example being the airline industry seems to be prepared to shut down completely in the hope that they get a taxpayer bailout.
But John, these are not economic measures, they're anti-economic measures. What's happened is, in a country which is now almost entirely a service economy, what we've done is we've pretty much shut down the service sector. I don't know where you live, but where I live, everything is just shut. People who relied on businesses to either buy things from them or to provide them with employment are left with no source of employment at all, no source of money. And I don't know whether many of these businesses will ever open again. And this happens at a time when you might not know this from looking at the British media, but it is true. It happens at a time when the world economy is undergoing its worst convulsion, certainly since 2008, and probably since further back than that, when these things are already in danger. And now for untold weeks and months, we have no idea when this will end, especially if we don't question the premise of it. For untold weeks and months, all these businesses face a continued, complete inability to trade. What effect do you think this is going to have?
Peter,
It should really
Peter,
very carefully what's happening.
The economy will eventually recover. The economy will eventually recover. You can't bring people back from the dead.
Why will it recover? Where is the money to come from to make it recover? Funny money will have to be magic.
I think if I could just answer that, I mean, I tell you what, Peter. When you could argue whether some of these cafes and restaurants and so on will reopen, but I'm sure those that do, I bet you when the lockdown is lifted, there'll be one hell of a party in pubs and restaurants and other eating and drinking establishments around the land.
Maybe there will be, but after the party is over, all those balance sheets and empty bank accounts and huge overdrafts and disappeared jobs will still remain. There will be the most tremendous hangover.
Well, no, people will start hiring again.
Well,
a lot of people have only been laid off temporarily.
Already jobs are disappearing in this country at an astonishing rate. How many of these people now being furloughed are ever going to be hired again? It's just astonishing that this enormous story of the trashing of our economy by deliberate government action is barely covered at a time, as I say, when we are in the throes of a global economic crisis as bad as anything since 2008, which might well be made worse by it. Unless the premise of this thing is challenged, and that's the job, it seems to me, of the Fourth Estate, to challenge it. Unless it is challenged, this thing can go on indefinitely without challenge. And even if it stops, it can
I don't think it'll go on indefinitely,
again.
Peter.
Gentlemen, let me just bring Laura back in, because she's covered this right from the very start when we first heard about an inkling of a problem in Wuhan. Laura, when Professor Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance listen to this podcast, as I'm sure they will, what will they make of what Peter is saying? What would they say to his summary?
I mean, I think the bottom line is that this is a new virus. So, it's not flu. It's not flu. It's a new virus. So that's why it's throwing up all sorts of new problems, because there isn't the vaccine. There isn't any kind of immunity amongst us if we've not had it yet. I think what they did is they looked at their advisors, and their advisors were saying, if you don't do anything, 500,000 people in the country are going to die. That's the bottom line. If you carry on doing a little bit, then you'll probably get 250,000 people dying. And I think the politicians, the scientists said, that isn't a situation we can deal with. There will be huge, huge economic implications with any of these measures. And we know that. We're all feeling it right now. We're all witnessing it. But the reality was, so many lives were going to be lost. They had to do something, and they had to do something drastically. That's the reason behind all of it.
Politicians are always impressed by boffins. It's just like they're impressed by military leaders as well, because most politicians know nothing about science, and so they apart from Michael Gove, do you remember in that famous interview when he said, "Let's not listen to experts anymore"? Most politicians are impressed by boffins and experts.
The Imperial College experts whose advice the government has accepted without question are not the only people in this field, and there are many others. Particularly the extraordinarily distinguished Professor Sucharit Bhadke in Mainz in Germany, who says absolutely emphatically these policies are wrong. And then you get the also equally impressive Professor John Ioannidis of Stanford University, who's a great debunker of scientific nonsense, who says the whole basis of the mortality claims being made is wrong. And then you get Professor John Lee writing in The Spectator pointing out the deaths which are being attributed to coronavirus, that are being said to have been caused by coronavirus, are actually of people who've died with coronavirus, but not of it, a crucial medical statistical distinction, which is not being made in the figures being churned out. And I think that you also have to notice the recent Oxford report, which very much challenges the Imperial Group, and also the record of the Imperial Group. Some of you will probably remember, I certainly do, because I went and stood next to farms in Devon with great pyres of burning cattle and farmers weeping, the foot and mouth epidemic, in which the Imperial Group urged the policy of mass slaughter of healthy cattle. I think an awful lot of people looking back on that would now say that was a mistake. So the fact that these people are experts doesn't necessarily mean that they're right. And as Jonathan Sumption correctly said in his original article for the Times and his interview yesterday, the well-informed layman, and indeed the politician and everybody else, has a right to examine advice. They don't have to take scientific advice as gospel, and if it doesn't make sense, and if it doesn't work, then they don't have to necessarily listen to that particular expert. They can look for another one. But I do think people should look much more widely at what is actually being said, especially at Professor Badke, who's written an open letter to the Chancellor of Germany saying that the direction which is being taken is mistaken. And it's well worth reading. He's made 2 YouTube films of extraordinary clarity and patience and gentleness and also force, which everybody who's at all interested in this should watch. And you'll find them on the Peter Hitchens blog, because that's the only place you can.
Shameless self-promotion, Peter.
You got it in there. Listen, we are running out of time. We are running out of time, so I must thank you all there. Always grateful to get the thoughts of my wife, Laura Bundock. Thank you very much for being with us on the podcast, as well as John Craig, political correspondent, Sky News, and Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens. Fantastic speaking to you all. Thank you.